Hi, Michelle Glass here. Welcome back to another episode of our Chapter 6, Lecture 6 series, and our topic for this video is how bone grows. So when we're talking about bone growth, we can refer to this as either osteogenesis or ossification. Now, osteogenesis is really referring to the formation of new bone, while ossification is talking about turning a tissue into bone. So there's a slight difference there, but we can kind of talk about it either way. Calcification is a part of osteogenesis. Calcification is where you add those calcium salts, so that calcium phosphate or hydroxyapatite crystals, making your tissue hard. Now, calcification can occur in tissues other than bone, so it is not a process that is specific to bone, but this is really when and where this process should be taking place. Now, in order to get bone growth, you're going to see involvement of those osteogenic cells. So remember, there are stem cells, so they are making more osteoblasts. Osteoblasts are the type of cell that's responsible for laying down that bony matrix, so the formation of bone. But we'll see osteoclasts involved too. Remember, these are our cells that do recycling or removal of that bony matrix. So we'll see that there's a job for them here and the formation of our new bone as well. When we talk about osteogenesis or ossification, there's two different techniques. There's one called endochondral and another method called intramembranous. And both of these methods are used in the formation of your skeleton. We'll talk about each one of those. And then we'll see that there's two different types of growth. You have what's called appositional growth, which is where you're not changing the position of the bone, but you're increasing the diameter. So appositional without position change. So it's not getting longer, it's getting fatter. Or interstitial growth, which is that increase in length. And that's going to stop around age 25 or so. That's about when we have our finished, mature skeleton. Now we'll see, even though your skeleton stops increasing in length around age 25, we still have changes that are happening to our skeleton throughout life. So for instance, that appositional growth can continue to happen even after you've reached your mature skeleton length. Okay, so let's talk about that endochondral ossification. Endochondral ossification is going to occur in the formation of our long bones. So most of the skeleton is formed in this way. It is going to be a process where you start out with hyaline cartilage and then you convert that into bone. And it's starting about 8th week of fetal development and again continuing until about 25 years of age or close to that kind of age limit. And I've listed here endochondral ossification is occurring with your long bones, but we will see it with actually most of the bones in our body. Okay, so let's take a look at the diagrams provided for us in our textbook. What we see happening first is that the fetus is going to form these primitive limb bones, these primitive limbs, and they're going to do this by making hyaline cartilage first. And then we're going to see some changes happening in the hyaline cartilage. So the chondrocytes, those are the cartilage cells, are going to get larger, and you're going to start to see some addition of calcium to the matrix. And instead of it being a continuous hyaline cartilage matrix, we'll see that it's starting to kind of look kind of like a cartilage spongy bone to some extent. We will see that the blood vessels are going to grow up to the outside of that primitive bone, and with it, the blood is bringing hormones, triggering some changes. So we're going to start to see those cartilage cells on the outside of that primitive bone turning into osteoblasts and starting to lay down bony matrix on the outside at the diaphysis. And then we see those blood vessels are penetrating the inside of the diaphysis, bringing with it the hormone signals. This is creating what we call our primary ossification center, because this is the first place really where we start to see bone formation. And notice that we see first that cartilage is turned into spongy bone, and we're seeing our formation of our medullary cavity. From there, we have a process which is called remodeling. Remodeling is something that's happening here during the formation of bone, but it's also a process that's happening throughout the entire life of our skeleton. Remodeling is just what it sounds like. So just like if you're going to remodel your kitchen, you're going to pull out your old cabinets and install new cabinets. In the case here of the bone, you're going to remove old bone and lay in new bone. And so, of course, this is where we see those osteoclasts, which is our recycling cell coming along, removing the old bone and laying in new bone. So what we're going to see here is remodeling is happening to really increase the size of that medullary cavity. Remember, medullary cavity is important for blood cell formation. So when we start to see changes to our skeleton, we need to realize that that means changes are happening in the whole body. And one of those changes is we need more blood. And so we're going to need a bigger marrow cavity so we can make more blood cells. Okay, so then we start to see a penetration of blood vessels at each epiphysis. So now we have a secondary ossification center, and it's basically a repeat of what we saw at the primary ossification center, but just in our epiphyses. Okay, so then what we see happening is this process is continuing where you're seeing the formation of bone, the remodeling of that bone, forming those cavities. We're going to get spongy bone at our epiphyses. We're getting our medullary cavity in the diaphysis. Notice that in that space in between, you keep cartilage there as long as your bone is growing. And that area then here is referred to as the epiphysial cartilage. In the future, this will become our metaphysis, but it's not called that yet. The epiphyseal cartilage is what you might think of as your growth plate. So as long as you maintain epiphyseal cartilage, you're able to increase the size of your bone. So what we see happening is you start by making more cartilage, turn that into bone. Make more cartilage, turn that into bone. Make more cartilage, turn that into bone, until you get that final length of your bone. At the end of this whole process, we're talking about maybe all the way up until age 25. That's going to be when you see what's called epiphyseal closure happening. Epiphyseal closure is when that metaphysis shows up. That's going to be when the epiphyseal cartilage gets totally ossified and converted then into an epiphyseal line. So an epiphyseal line is really another word for that metaphysis. That signals the end of the interstitial growth or the growth in length of that bone. Okay, so we left off here with our conversation about endochondral ossification, or the formation of the long bone and how it's growing. And as long as you have the epiphyseal cartilage, you're going to continue increasing in length. And we see that that's happening until about age 25. What we're going to look at next is the appositional growth, which remember means the change in diameter or the growth without change in position. And what we see happening here is that the osteoblasts in the periosteum are going to secrete that bony matrix. And when they do that, then those osteoblasts are going to be surrounded by bone. And so we're going to call them osteocytes at that point. Remember, the osteocyte is the mature bone cell that's responsible for maintaining that bony matrix. This is going to create an increase in that circumferential lamellae, which remember is that lamellae on the outside there closest to the periosteum. And eventually then it will be remodeled into concentric lamellae. So that means those osteon units. Remodeled is talking about the job of those osteoclasts coming in, breaking apart the bone that's already formed, and then those osteoblasts rebuilding that bone. So it's going to change the way that that bone matrix is organized. And then we're going to see, in addition to those changes, that the osteoclasts are removing the inner bone matrix to increase the size of our medullary cavity. And this is important because if our bone is increasing in diameter, it's doing that because our body mass has increased. So maybe we've increased our muscle mass, so that's a good way of increasing your body mass, or maybe you've increased your amount of adipose tissue, and that's another way that you can increase body mass. The bone has to be able to support that body size, so that's why we're going to increase the diameter of our bone. And if our diameter of our bone is increasing, that means again that our body is increasing in size, and so clearly we need more blood flowing to all of that new tissue. With our endochondral ossification, we talked about this as being the formation of our long bones, starting with hyaline cartilage, converting that into bone. We said that this begins as early as the 8th week of fetal development, and it continues until about age 25. Now, most of the skeleton is formed via endochondral ossification, but some of it is formed through intramembranous ossification. In this case, you're looking at the conversion of dermis into bone, and this is happening really with, like, I think 6 bones. So the flat cranial bones, so that would be frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal. And then your mandible and your clavicles. Okay, so 6 of our bones are formed through the intramembranous ossification, so that means everything else is through endochondral. When we talk about the intramembranous ossification, this is when you have dermal cells, so that means cells of your dermis, remember that's that inner layer of your cutaneous membrane, are converted into osteoblasts. Osteoblasts, remember, are our building bone cells, so they are going to start ossifying the dermis, trapping those osteoblasts into bone, and converting them then into osteocytes. Now, the bone formation is extending from these ossification centers, and it's forming what look like little struts, or what are called spicules. So it's going to start out looking like spongy bone. Those spicules are fusing together to form the spongy bone that's trapping those blood vessels. And then we'll see that the outermost bone tissue will be remodeled to become compact bone. So those bones, those flat bones that we mentioned that are made via intramembranous ossification, are going to be like a compact bone, spongy bone sandwich. Compact bone, spongy bone, compact bone. The last thing to pay attention to is that, bone is full of living cells, and all living cells need access to blood vessels in order to get oxygen and nutrition and hormones and waste removal. And so it's important to pay attention to the fact that our blood is highly vascularized. We have several important canals and foramen for those blood vessels to penetrate. They're going throughout that whole medullary cavity and woven through the epiphyses, sticking through those central canals. Remember, all these passageways are going to be lined by the endosteum. Okay, that's it for now.